Welcome to Great Automotive Lives. I'm your host, Andrew, the classic car guy. I'm a motoring writer, photographer, and now, inexplicably, in the chilly autumn of my career, a Johnny-come-lately podcaster. This podcast aims to bring to life the stories, histories, intrigue and drama surrounding some of the automotive world's most interesting characters. Some may be well known, others less so, but I hope you will find all, in some small way, warrant you investing a little of your listening time hearing about lives remarkably lived. If nothing else, I hope something you hear today prompts further reading, listening or watching. We are of course privileged, after all, to live in a world today where the ability to drink in fascinating facts and information is limited only by one's thirst for knowledge. All that said, shall we crack on?
Why the Life of William Morris?
For my fifth episode of Great Automotive Lives, I am admittedly a little conflicted to bring you the life of William Morris of Morris Cars fame. There is no real doubt that Morris was a towering automotive figure, of course. The parallels with episode 4's Herbert Austin are very striking indeed, and to exclude Morris would be to feature Ying without even mentioning Yang. Something else that occurs, but is perhaps no surprise given the British predilection for reserve, is how little fuss we make about these two towering automotive giants. I would imagine, but am happy to be corrected, that your average American would know something of the life of Henry Ford. The British every person, I suspect, may well have heard of Austin and Morris cars, but I don't think would know anything of the men behind them. I may be wrong, of course. I hope I am. Let me know your thoughts, as long as they're kind. Why the confliction, I hear you ask? Well, Morris seems to potentially have had a much darker side as a person, or at least some allege that he did. Whilst his pre-World War II dalliance with fascism is well documented, allegations that surfaced as recently as 2015 appear much more troubling still. I wish to make no attempt to swerve these controversies and will cover them in due course. In a strict sense, however, these matters do not directly affect the automotive legacy that Morris left behind, and so, for better or worse, here he is.
The Life of William Morris.
You can learn a very great deal about William Morris by visiting his long-term home, Nuffield Place. Nuffield Place is nestled in the Chiltern Hills, about 4 miles east of Wallingford in Oxfordshire and about half an hour from the Cowley plant. Originally named Merrow Mount, the house was designed by Oswald Partridge Milne, an assistant of the renowned architect Edwin Landseer Lutens. The house was built during 1914 specifically for the superbly named Sir John Bowring Wimble, a shipping magnate. The house is a beautiful example of the arts and crafts movement, asymmetrical in design, made from a variety of building materials and yet surprisingly unfussy in its construction. Wimble had specified a small country house with a big garden, and as such Nuffield Place had just 8 principal rooms, originally with grounds of around 10 acres. On Wimble's death, his widow would sell the house to William Morris in 1933. For Sir John and his wife, the house had been a modest country bolt-hole. William and Elizabeth Morris would make the house their only home for the rest of their lives. History remains annoyingly opaque about how much money changed hands to secure the house. However, at around this time, Morris was reputedly earning £2,000 a day, and the average UK house price in 1934 was under £600. Even considering the house's idyllic bucolic location, generous grounds, and quality of construction, it is quite possible that it cost Morris less than a few days' income. Morris set about adapting the house to his and Elizabeth's needs by adding a billiards room, a sun lounge, and updating the plumbing and electrics. The house was renamed Nuffield Place in tribute to the hamlet in which it stands. Morris would adopt the Nuffield name to accompany his baronet, later baron, and ultimately viscount titles. To their eternal regret, William and Elizabeth would never have any children, and the house was bequeathed to Nuffield College, Oxford, upon Morris's death in 1963. The college maintained the house, but did little else with it. Its contents were left exactly as they were found upon the death of its illustrious occupants. By 2010, the college was considering selling the house and contents to raise funds. Luckily, however, Nuffield Place and all within was gifted to the National Trust in 2011. This means today everyone can marvel at the humble and unpretentious way in which the super-rich Morrises lived. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia was invited to dine at Nuffield Place in 1954. It was reported that Lady Nuffield laid the table herself. Food brought from the neighbouring golf club was warmed up by the hostess before she served it up to all assembled. In many ways the house remains a 1930s archetype, despite Lady Nuffield living there until her death in 1959, and Lord Nuffield 4 years longer. The furniture is mostly modest 20th century reproductions of earlier styles, and there are no ensuite bathrooms, and despite there being the luxury of a heated towel rail, chamber pots were still seemingly in use. The great man's bedroom, he and Elizabeth understood the secret to a long marriage, separate rooms, possibly tells us most about his character. There is no bed head, but the single bed is pushed up against a tiled fireplace surround. Quite draughty, one might imagine. A reading lamp is roughly jerry-rigged above the bed, apparently by Morris himself. The room is carpeted with offcuts from one of his factories, and his fascination with clocks accounts for the 8 that are on display here. Opening the wardrobe reveals not clothes, but a messy, well-equipped workshop in miniature. Here Morris would repair items from around the house, including his own shoes, granting them a few extra years' utility in the process. Quite revealingly, the 2 guest rooms are much more richly furnished and fitted than those of the Morrises. It's unclear if Emperor Haile Selassie stayed the night in 1954, but one suspects not. The billiard room underscores some of Morris's virtues as well as some of his vices. Alongside well-used tennis rackets and a croquet set are several drinks decanters, an array of serious smoking paraphernalia. From a personal perspective, one of the Morrises' key virtues was their insistence on having at least one Scottish Terrier in their homes at all times. As someone who is currently owned and managed by a 9-year-old female Scottie, I can attest to the peerless charm and character of the breed, as well as the necessary stoicism, fortitude, and courage of their cohabitees, or subordinates, as the Scottie would have it. Like the Morrises, I wouldn't have it any other way. In 1939, Morris presented his wife with a pre-production Wolseley 8 for her birthday. Morris had acquired Wolseley at auction from the receivers in 1927, using £730,000 of his own money. Basically a badge-engineered Morris 8, its full-scale production at Cowley was delayed until after the war. Again, it was a modest choice for a couple of such immodest means, but the car remained in regular use by Lady Nuffield until her death, and thereafter by Lord Nuffield until frailty necessitated the services of a chauffeur. By that point the Wolseley would have been well over 20 years old. The frugality with which Morris lived was thrown into sharp and striking contrast by his breathtaking generosity in other areas. During his lifetime, Viscount Nuffield would donate approximately £30 million to predominantly medical-worthy causes. Depending on who you speak to and where you look, that equates to somewhere between 1 and 2 billion in today's terms. William Richard Morris was born on the 10th of October 1877 Not in Oxford, as one may legitimately expect, but over 70 miles away in Worcester. Both his parents were from Oxfordshire, however, with his father Frederick being from Witney and his mother Emily was from Headington. William was the eldest of 7 children, but in a tragedy all too common at that time, only he and his youngest 2 sisters would survive infancy. At the time of William's birth, Frederick was working as a draper's assistant in Worcester. By 1880, however, his father-in-law, Richard Pever, needed help on his farm due to his failing sight. Frederick agreed to become Pever's bailiff or farm manager, and the family moved to Wood Farm in Headington, Oxford. Young William aspired to become a doctor. When his father's asthma necessitated his retirement from farm work, William was ushered into an apprenticeship at a bicycle seller and repairer in St. Giles. William's apprenticeship lasted less than a year, however. When William asked for, but was refused, a pay rise, he resigned, much to the chagrin of his parents, no doubt. By age 16, William had set up his own business with a working capital of £4 and engaged in bicycle repair. Shortly afterwards, the family would move to a terrace house at 16 St. James Street, Oxford. From here, William would build his own bicycles in the garden shed from components bought from others. The bicycles would ultimately be displayed for sale in the front window of the house, and they soon built a local reputation for durability, value, and reliability. This reputation was no doubt bolstered by Morris's success racing his own machines. Morris branded the bikes that he made with a gilt cycle wheel and the words "The Morris" on them. Some races would see him go to compete as far away as the south of London. He was also active in and around his hometown, becoming at one point champion of Oxford, city and county, Berkshire, and Buckinghamshire for distances varying between 1 and 50 miles. By 1901, the business was doing well enough for Morris to rent 48 High Street, Oxford. He would continue with bicycle repair and manufacture, but from here he also started dabbling with motorcycles at around this time. In 1902, he acquired a garage in Longwall Street, specifically for the purpose of motorcycle manufacture. In 1903, however, Morris made a couple of decisions that would help shape the remainder of his life, one positive and the other not so. Firstly, he wed Elizabeth Lizzie Maud Anstey, the daughter of a farrier. William and Lizzie would remain married until the latter's death in 1959, although some have speculated about the happiness of the union. Less positively, Morris went into partnership to form the Oxford Automobile and Cycle Agency. Morris eagerly took on the role of works manager, leaving the sales operation to his partner, one Walter Lancelot Craik. Craik was a wealthy undergraduate fresh out of Christ Church College. With his wealth entirely inherited, Craik could not have been more different from Morris. Craik's sales technique seemed to revolve around endless boozy lunches and dinners with other wealthy Oxford types. Such was his unfettered spending that the venture dissolved into bankruptcy in 1904. It was anecdotally reported that Lizzie Morris had to sell her jewellery in order to help Morris buy back his tools from the liquidators. The episode would have a lasting effect on William Morris. Some would speculate that it was the root cause for his penny-pinching lifestyle going forward. Others would point out that Morris would thereafter ensure he had complete control over his business ventures and developed a deep distrust of delegating responsibilities for many years. The bankruptcy did not deter Morris from continued endeavour, nor prevent him from securing a small bank loan in order to start over. This time, however, his focus was on the nascent motor car. Soon he was selling, repairing, and hiring out cars, and held concessions for Arrol Johnson, Belsize, Humber, Hupmobile, Singer, Standard, and Wolseley marks, all under the name the Oxford Garage. In 1910, Morris built new bespoke premises in Longwall Street. that one local paper would describe as the Oxford Motor Palace. Business was so good that additional premises were also taken on in Queen Street. That same year, the garage would be renamed the Morris Garage. Between 1911 and 1912, as well as running his eponymous garage, Morris was busy designing his first car. In 1912, W.R. Morris Motors Limited was registered, with William Morris as the sole ordinary shareholder, and £4,000 borrowed from the 7th Earl of Macclesfield in the form of preference shares. Morris had met the Earl in 1905 when the titled undergraduate was involved in a collision while at the wheel of a car hired from Morris. A useful contact and a motoring enthusiast, Macclesfield was prepared to support Morris now in his manufacturing of his own cars. Delays in producing his car's engine forced Morris to sell his car from blueprints at the 1912 Motor Show. This may sound familiar to those who have listened to my previous podcast about Herbert Austin. He sold 400 of the imaginatively named Morris Oxford. Morris's approach to car manufacture was very American in its methodology initially. Most British companies would strive to control the in-house manufacture of all components they required. It was said, for example, of Austin's Longbridge plant that steel would go in one end and cars would come out the other. Morris preferred the outsourced manufacture of components. Despite his penchant for autocratic control, one can only assume that this less capital-intensive approach suited him in his early days of manufacture. Interestingly, as his business developed, Morris would buy up most of his major suppliers in turn, as if in a game of automotive monopoly. I bet Morris would favour the Scotty dog counter if he ever actually did play Monopoly. The first Morris Oxford was produced in April 1913. That year he produced 1,300 cars, putting him immediately amongst the top British car makers. Due to this immediate success, Morris in early 1913 first rented and then purchased the derelict Military Training College in Holloway, Cowley. He used the 3-story building to assemble bull-nosed Morris cars, and he and Lizzie moved into the manor house within the college grounds. During late 1913, the old parade ground was covered with a 100,000 square foot building and created the factory space Morris now needed. Pretty soon the Morris Motor Works would expand out along both sides of Garsington Road and beyond the Ring Road. Morris would occupy a small scruffy office at the plant, one, a bit like his next home, that would remain exactly the same until he last used it shortly before his death in 1963. By 1914, Morris's annual revenues amounted to over £150,000, and the company was outselling its key rivals, Vauxhall and Austin. However, 85% of its profits up to that point were reinvested in order to fund further growth and development, both in the form of improvements to the Cowley manufacturing plant and negotiating of new contracts for parts. Even as Morris settled into Cowley and started to plan his second car, the, wait for it, Morris Cowley, the embers of a worldwide conflict were being fanned into roaring flames. Like so many others, Morris was required to turn a proportion of Cowley production over to Britain's war effort. Morris also managed to turn many of the restrictions of the wartime economy into positive opportunities. As well as munitions, Morris volunteered the site for the manufacture of copies of a recovered German mine sinker. The lower car sales volume was of course unfortunate, but it did allow Morris a little time and space to hone his manufacturing facilities to put the business in the right shape for a post-war world. Morris emerged from the Great War with another name change to Morris Motors Limited and a compact and differentiated model lineup. The Cowley was the entry-level model and the Oxford its more luxurious older sibling. Inevitably, after a global conflict, the economy was in flux. Demand for cars was growing, but slowly. What wasn't growing slowly, however, was inflation. This issue was writ large in the price of the cowley, which had grown by more than 50% between 1919 and 1920, and the resulting dampening effect on sales threatened the future of the business. William Morris wasn't prepared to have all of his hard-won success squandered, and so took a calculated risk, but a big one nonetheless. Morris ordered that almost all of the cowley's price rise be reversed as from February 1921. They say fortune favours the brave, and so it seemed with Morris. Between 1921 and 24, Morris production increased more than tenfold. Between 1921 and 1927, almost 20-fold. By 1927, Morris's cars were sold in 1,750 franchises nationwide, and the company's rivals were almost universally caught on the hop. Morris Motors' market share rose from approximately 10% in 1921 to over 40% by 1925. In hindsight, it is accepted that Morris single-handedly created the mainstream automobile market in Great Britain, essentially through the force of his will alone. Funded by this dramatic growth, Morris would spend the early and mid-1920s buying out his key suppliers and others to effectively reverse the firm's early outsourced supply chain model. Key acquisitions would include Osberton Radiators, vehicle bodybuilders Hollick and Pratt of Coventry, engine and gearbox manufacturers Hotchkiss, and axle, gearbox and steering manufacturers E.G. Wrigley & Co. Limited of Birmingham. By the end of 1926, the SU Carburetor Company was snapped up, and the following year, Wolseley Motors was bought from under the nose of long-time rival and Wolseley alumni Herbert Austin. By 1928, the MG Car Company was formally constituted, 100% owned by William Morris, of course, and the Abington factory opened in 1929, 12 miles from Cowley. Since around 1921, Morris's sales manager Cecil Kimber had been creating special-bodied Morris Oxford chassis as sports cars, which were sold from 1924 under the Morris Garages badge, later trimmed down to MG and put into an octagon that fitted neatly on a radiator cap. During the late 1920s, Morris also shunned merger or takeover offers from other industry players. A merger was suggested by long-time nemesis Herbert Austin. A more left-field takeover offer came from General Motors, who were keen to establish a European bridgehead. Morris quickly gave both pretty short shrift. After Herbert Austin's death, a merger would indeed be agreed by Morris. GM, of course, would go on to buy Vauxhall of Luton and Opel of Germany to further their European aspirations. By the 1930s, however, Morris was starting to drift a little, and the market had consolidated somewhat. Many British makers had either failed or been acquired in the post-Great War period, and just the big six were prominent: Morris, Austin, Ford, Vauxhall, Rootes, and Standard. As the market grew, Morris's share began to drop. Their range was now complex, and Morris's capabilities were being stretched by the size of his empire. Factories were now aging and sprawling, and some of Morris's senior hires had been less than inspired. Basically, at the hands of Austin and Ford, Morris's market share fell from 35% in 1929 to 20% in 1933. Morris needed help and decided to elevate Wolseley manager Leonard Lord to the role of managing director of the group. Lord immediately took the fight directly to Ford with the development, within just 18 months, of the Morris 8. In many ways, the 8 was pretty much a direct copy of the Ford Y, which was the first blue oval product designed specifically for Britain and Europe. It's even suggested that the Morris 8's 918cc side valve engine was derived by stripping down the Ford Y motor and measuring all the components. Allegedly. The 8 was a huge success. In its first full year, 1935, over 53,000 were sold. In 1936, Morris produced 96,000 cars, a record pre-war total. There were 220,000 8s produced in 4 years, and it became Britain's most popular car of the 1930s. Morris was back on form, and by some measures was considered the largest manufacturer in Europe, with capacity at Cowley exceeding Germany's total and being roughly the same as that of France. In 1934, Morris was created Baron Nuffield, and thereafter his growing group of companies became known collectively as the Nuffield Organisation. In 1936, Leonard Lord, who in no small part helped put Morris back on top, suddenly left the company. Rumours at the time suggested Morris's innate stinginess had soured the relationship. Lord had always insisted that Morris pay him what he thought Lord was worth. By the mid-1930s, it seemed the two men had diverging views on what that figure should be. Lord departed acrimoniously, apparently vowing to take Cowley apart brick by bloody brick. By 1938, Lord was at Austin, no doubt to Morris's disgust. The Second World War was significantly more challenging for Morris than the First. This in many ways was down to William Morris's inability to compromise or soften his views to suit the extraordinary circumstances. Firstly, there was the Shadow Factory saga. At the start of the war, the government had initiated a Shadow Factory program. Under the program, the government funded the building of factories to be run by an industry partner, usually from the motor industry, on the basis that the government could order it to be used to build armaments when they were required. Austin, Standard and Roots were all enthusiastic participants in the program. Morris, however, initially declined, preferring instead to try and interest the government in his Wolseley aero engine. In the end, Morris would come on board reluctantly, and a factory was established at Castle Bromwich, later to become the Jaguar Land Rover plant near Birmingham. The government placed an order with Morris for 1,000 Spitfires from what was at the time the world's largest purpose-built aircraft factory. Quite quickly it became clear that Morris was outside his comfort zone producing the fighter aircraft. His approach was to consider the order as a big batch of Morris 8s, a cookie-cutter approach where all 1,000 were clones of each other. The nature of the iconic aircraft was still evolving, however, and this was an anathema to Morris. In May 1940, Winston Churchill appointed Press Baron Lord Beaverstock as Minister of Aircraft Production, with a brief to get output ramped up by any means. In a subsequent telephone conversation between Morris and Beaverbrook, Morris rhetorically asked, "Would you like me to give up control of the Spitfire factory?" Beaverbrook simply replied, "I accept," and hung up. Morris appealed to Churchill, but to no avail. It's fair to suggest, in hindsight, that Winston had bigger fish to fry. For the majority of the war, Miles Thomas was fulfilling the Leonard Lord managing director role. Thomas worked hard to put Morris in the best possible shape for the post-war world, as he felt that Lord Nuffield was becoming out of touch, now in his 60s, with what the world wanted. This led Thomas to go behind his boss's back and greenlight Alec Issigonis's Mosquito concept, which would finally emerge in 1948 as the new Morris Minor. Nuffield was not a fan of the car or of its innovative designer. He described the car's styling as being reminiscent of a poached egg. As for Issigonis, Morris refused to even set eyes on him, let alone speak and meet with him. He would refer to Isigonis as "that foreigner." One also suspects that Morris knew of the designer's sexual preferences and emphatically did not approve. That aside, the miner was a technological tour de force and included just about everything available in 1943. Monocoque construction, independent front suspension, rack and pinion steering, an engine pushed well forward for space, smaller wheels for space efficiency, and an advanced flat-four engine. In actuality, it showcased many of the world-changing innovations that the Mini would feature in 1959. The Miner, of course, would go on to be Britain's first car to sell 1 million units. With Morris's long-time nemesis and rival Herbert Austin now dead, Leonard Lord took charge at Longbridge. Despite his earlier vow to destroy Morris, Lord was now looking to do a deal. By 1948, Nuffield had agreed to set up a cooperative purchasing collective with Austin. By 1951, and now aged 74, and without an heir to carry the torch, Nuffield capitulated to Lord's advances and agreed a merger. Lord would continue as managing director of now the world's fourth largest car manufacturer and Europe's biggest. Nuffield agreed to assume the role of chairman. At the first AGM of the new company in 1952, Nuffield caught everyone by surprise. He sped through the formalities in a matter of a few minutes before resigning as chairman, accepting the honorary post of life president, and retiring fully from the business. Lord Nuffield's record of philanthropy has been touched upon already, and is probably for a podcast not automotive related to fully cover. In other ways, however, William Morris could be considered controversial. The truth, as always in hindsight, is hard to establish, but there are plenty of sources that take diametrically opposed views on Morris's allegedly darker side. In the spirit of balance and objectivity, it seems prudent just to recount matters that seem to be of public record. Morris was known to have been a donor and backer to Sir Oswald Mosley, his brown shirts, and British fascism. Between 1931 and 1932, Morris gave Mosley £35,000 to fund the anti-Semitic newspaper Action, and £50,000 to finance Mosley's fascist New Party, which was subsequently absorbed into the British Union of Fascists. Today, both sums would equate to several £1,000,000. After 1932, Morris would cease any public support of fascism. In 1934, he even released a public statement through the Jewish Chronicle condemning fascism and anti-Semitism, whilst at the same time announcing a donation made to the Central British Fund for German Jewry in support of European Jewish refugees. Numerous sources, however, claim that for many years after this, Morris continued to subscribe to the anti-Jewish newspaper, The Patriot. There is much written about Morris's anti-union stance as well. He was careful to avoid the mass unionization of his empire, certainly, but he also introduced some progressive welfare policies for his employees, such as holiday pay. Perhaps the most shocking allegation didn't publicly emerge until 2015, over 50 years after his death. In 2015, Anne Vaughan alleged that she had been sexually abused by Nuffield for a period of more than 10 years in the 1940s and the 1950s. From the age of 12, when the industrialist would have been in his 60s. She claimed that her parents were complicit in the abuse by turning a blind eye in return for lavish gifts from Morris, made from his personal fortune. At age 79, Anne was concerned that she might die before she shared her shocking secret, so she decided to make a police statement. Anne wanted her account of events to be held on file in case other victims felt the need to come forward at a future date. Lord Nuffield passed away on the 27th of August 1963. Aged 85 years old. There was a small ceremony at Oxford Crematorium followed by a burial of ashes at Nuffield Parish Church.
William Morris in summary.
Morris is an interesting yet divisive subject. It's clear that his rise from very humble beginnings to become the most accomplished of captains of industry is almost unprecedented in the British automotive business. The similarities between Morris and the subject of my previous podcast, Herbert Austin, are particularly striking. History probably suggests that Morris's was the more significant legacy, no doubt helped by his well-documented and impressively generous philanthropy. Austin died a good 20 years before Morris, of course, so perhaps those extra years helped better cement the latter's place in history. I think it remains very hard to feel quite so positive towards Morris, knowing of his dark side, be it just alleged or proven. It seems to remain undisputed that he was a generous funder of extreme right-wing politics, even if that was just a misguided interlude in his life. Morris's extreme thriftiness, bordering on meanness, seems a little unnecessary given his impressive wealth and on balance a moderately unattractive trait. All this pales into insignificance, of course, in light of Anne Vaughan's shocking allegations of 2015. If true, they would absolutely put the skids under Morris's reputation and all the august organisations that still bear the Nuffield name. With Lord Nuffield long dead and the police not pursuing Anne's complaint, we will likely never know the truth. A great automotive life, most certainly. A great man. The jury is surely out, and seems likely to remain so.
In the footsteps of William Morris.
William Morris is so profoundly intertwined with Oxford and its view of itself that the city and its environs offer a veritable cornucopia of Morris tributes and associated Easter eggs. Thanks to the generosity of Nuffield College and the great works of the National Trust, Nuffield Place is open to the public and preserved for prosperity. It represents a fascinating time capsule of modest 1930s living, and may help one form a firmer opinion of the character of this famous Viscount. Both Lord Nuffield and his wife Lizzie were cremated at Oxford Crematorium in Bayswater Road, Headington, and their ashes were buried at Nuffield Parish Church. There is a memorial plaque to them at the crematorium, with Lizzie Maud wrongly named as Elizabeth Maud with an E, sadly underscoring her seemingly very minor historical profile compared to that of her husband. Nuffield Parish Church graveyard contains a well-maintained, carved memorial stone in tribute to Morris. The famous Cowley plant ultimately became a sprawling estate, utterly dominating the Cowley area. The north and south works were demolished in 1993. In their place today stands the Oxford Business Park, where organisations and businesses such as Oxfam, Royal Mail and Harley-Davidson have their offices. The site's industrial past is still celebrated, however, by the estate's Alec Isigonis Way and the Nuffield Needle standing at the entrance to the park on Garsington Road. Another part of the historic plant remains, but in a markedly different form. Today, Plant Oxford, as it is called, is run by BMW and employs 3,700 people, manufacturing up to 900 minis every day, and has contributed over 2.25 million minis to the tally of over 11.65 million cars that the factory has produced since 1913. The Morris Garage building on Longwall Street continued to be used by Morris Garages until the mid to late 1970s. Although at one time threatened with demolition, it survives today as residential accommodation for New College, with the original brick frontage retained and a small display in one of the windows outlining the history of the building. The house at 16 James Street, where William Morris grew up and built bicycles, is still standing and is marked today by a blue plaque. What is now Oxford Crown Court on St Aldate's was once the site of the magnificent state-of-the-art Morris Motors showroom. Here you can see a work by Martin Jennings commemorating Morris. The sculpture, unveiled in 1999 and carved in Portland stone, shows Morris above an inscribed plaque in which Jennings himself said, "WM looks like he's leaning on his garden fence." As with our previous great automotive life, that of Herbert Austin, this country's marvellous motor museums all cover Morris's exploits to a greater or lesser extent. The British Motor Museum at Gaydon has long hosted an exhibit showing Morris's office from Cowley, recreated as it was left. From March 2025, this recreation will be joined side by side by Herbert Austin's office from Longbridge. This will give visitors a fascinating insight into and comparison between these two British automotive giants and long-term rivals. In the accompanying show notes, you will definitely, by now I've got my act together, find links to these Morris-related tributes to assist you in your road trip planning. Happy motoring!
I truly hope you found today's great automotive life interesting, inspiring, or at the very least a useful jumping off point for your own onward journey of discovery. Much like an underinvested and dysfunctional mass transportation system, I'm reasonably likely to amble along again at some undefined point in the near, medium or far future to invite you to join me on another automotive tangent of discovery. Inevitably, and for the sake of brevity, the fascinating details of this great automotive life have been significantly distilled, and so preemptive apologies are offered for glaring omissions, of which there are probably many. Your input and feedback is welcome, of course, on the understanding that I'm pathetically thin-skinned, so go easy with me. A contact email address is trepidatiously provided in the accompanying show notes. Until then, please tell many others if you enjoyed this podcast, and even perhaps leave the 21st century's equivalent of a thumbs up at the Colosseum in the form of a warm and fluffy review. It not only helps me avoid becoming moodier and more irascible, but also helps others find the podcast and generally makes the world a tiny bit nicer for a vanishingly small number of people. If you hated it, tell no one. Until next time, dear listener,